Okay, we've made it over to chapter 38. Chapter 38. What we're going to try to do is cover chapter 38 and 39 tonight. And what we've done is we have made it to the section of Job where God enters into the discussion. Now, Job had stated that he wanted to speak with God, and we've been hearing this theme throughout the book since Job had been afflicted with the many ailments and the terrible things that had been happening to him. And what we're about to see is he is going to get his wish, but what he's going to do, he's going to get a little more than what he bargained for. He's going to get his audience with God, but he's going to get something else. If we go back to Job 13:22, he stated, "Then call thou, and I will answer. Or let me speak, and answer thou me." We look in Job 31, verse 35, and he says, "Oh, that one would hear me. Behold, my desire is that the Almighty would answer me, and that mine adversary had written a book." So what we're seeing in essence is that God is kind of coming in and picking up where Elihu had left off. And in a sense, as a reminder that Elihu knew some things, and that in effect he was closer in what he was thinking than what the three friends were. He was closer to the truth. He did not have all the answers. He didn't know everything either. And for that reason, God is going to step in. And why was it that Elihu didn't know all the answers either? God had not revealed it, had he? God had not provided that revelation to Job, for that matter. Certainly hadn't revealed it to the three friends who came to comfort Job, and of course had not revealed it to Elihu. And so because of that, God presents himself and he reminds Elihu, Job, and the other three that he had revealed some information, but he had not revealed all the information. They did not know some very important things. So what is God going to do? He's going to come in and he's going to aid them, as it were, in their learning. He's going to help them. And what develops before those men is that God is reminding them they had been darkening his counsel. They had been obscuring it. That's what that means. And he used different illustrations to demonstrate his greatness, his glory, his majesty, and his holiness. Now, I think it is very important to keep in mind as we review this interaction that goes on between God and these others, is that even in the conversation with Job, he never fully explains how things work, does he? He doesn't go into great detail, and he doesn't appear to Job and these men, and he says, I'm going to let you, in essence, have a look behind the curtain here. I'm going to give you answers to all the questions that you might have and answer all of those questions. He does not do that. He leaves some of those things without explanation. And the reason for that is God has not designed us to have perfect knowledge. Some things belong to God and to God alone. We see that in Deuteronomy 29:29. The secret things belong to God. There are some things he hasn't given us the privilege of knowing. In essence, some things are just simply not any of our business. He hasn't made arrangements for us to know that on this side of eternity. So it's just not for us to know. After the sources and the resources of the friends, Job and Elihu, had been exhausted, God spoke the final word. And now we remember, almost the last words Job spoke expressed a desire and practically a challenge for God to answer him, 31:35. He had requested for God to call and he would answer, or that he speak and God to answer. Now, instead of responding to either one of those requests, God met Job in Job's world. He appeared before Job, didn't he? A world of beauty and order, a world of mystery and wonder, upon which is the stamp of wisdom, power, and purpose. And notice, God made no reference to the background of this whole situation that we know about in chapters 1 and 2. He doesn't mention Job's suffering. He doesn't mention Job's questions or his charges or his harsh words, except to reveal Job had spoken without knowledge. He doesn't begin with Job, I had a discussion with Satan, and he said this and that, and then I said this. God doesn't have to defend himself. He doesn't have to answer to Job or to anyone else. So he didn't start off that way. But he didn't start off that way in Genesis chapter 1 either. He didn't defend his existence. He just simply stated, in the beginning, God. And then he proceeded to tell what he did. So, he didn't refer either to Elihu in his speech. Or did he simply fulfill a divine purpose? He didn't rebuke Elihu. So I'm not sure exactly how he felt toward him at this moment. God asked a series of more than 70 questions to Job. I didn't realize he had asked so many questions, but he did. And those questions would bring Job to his knees before the Almighty of heaven. They would bring him to an understanding that Job is just a little speck in the whole scheme of what God has going on in the universe. Really, Job is insignificant. Not that God doesn't love and appreciate Job. Not that Job isn't a great worker for God and a great child of God. But in the huge scheme of things, what is Job to this great working that God has going on? Well, he really is not going to amount to a whole lot. We're going to find out. I'm not trying to take anything away from Job as a faithful child of God. But Job's understanding of things is really pretty weak. Now, God's questions emphasize two great propositions: his authority in the material affairs of the universe, and his authority in the spiritual and the moral affairs of humanity. So in essence, God is the authority in all things, period. And he points that out. Now, these great questions that we're going to notice are still very humbling to the sincere believer in God. Chapter 38. God speaks to Job for the first time, and he answers him out of a whirlwind. Now, when we think of a whirlwind, the first thing when I read that word whirlwind that pops into my mind is a tornado-looking thing, a funnel cloud. Really, what the Hebrew word intends is a storm or a tempest. And if we look back to chapter 37, 21 through 24, Elihu saw a storm approaching. Now, it's very likely that storm is the storm out of which God was speaking to Job. So he's not speaking to Job out of a tornado funnel cloud that appeared. That would be virtually impossible for Job, right? God could do it, but what would be the result of everyone standing around that funnel cloud? They would be destroyed, wouldn't they? So there is a storm approaching, and things are happening inside that storm, and from that storm, God speaks to Job for the very first time. And he asks a question. And this is how we might state that question. Who is this by his ignorant words obscures my counsel or my plan or design in these afflictions? So someone is speaking ignorant words. They're obscuring his plan through the process of what has been happening. God had a plan, and someone is speaking ignorantly about the whole thing that has been going on. Now, who would fit into that category of speaking ignorantly about this process? Everybody. The whole bunch, right? Job spoke ignorantly. He didn't understand. Now, Job wasn't malicious, but he spoke ignorantly. And he did speak out of turn some, didn't he? The three friends, they were malicious. They certainly spoke ignorantly and malicious. Elihu, he spoke in anger, and his anger was directed toward the three, but really because they couldn't answer Job. He wanted them to shut Job down. So he's at fault as well. And so these questions that are about to happen demonstrate such a deep perception of the universe. They were vastly superior in knowledge to anything that anyone could have during that time, and they're proof of the source of where that knowledge came, which is the Creator. Job is an inspired work. Has to be. Now, Job was told this. He said he was told to gird up his loins like a man. What could that possibly mean?
Get ready to
prepare. Now, that term was used, they wore flowing gowns. If they were going to work, if they were going to play, if they were going to go to war, they had to take their dress tail and they had to gird it up and tie it around their waist with a girdle, or what we would call a belt, so they could be able to effectively do what they were going to do. So, Peter used that same expression to intend for them to gird up their minds in 1 Peter 1:13. He wanted them to, he used it intellectually. He told his writers, gird up the loins of your mind, prepare yourselves mentally. So he's telling Job, prepare yourself, because you're not prepared for what's about to happen to you. Get ready. You wanted to ask some questions or to answer some questions. Here it comes. And it did come. Now, Job's complaints, when we hear this darkened counsel, what that does, it makes the truth harder to see. And through Job's complaints, that made God's goodness harder to see. Job's complaining. Okay? I don't know that we can lay a whole lot of blame at God's feet or at Job's feet for his complaints, but the way he went about complaining and saying that it was God who did it, it made it harder for God's goodness to be perceived by other people. Okay? The three friends, they didn't cast a good light on God's activities by using that age-old expression that the good are always blessed and the wicked are always punished. Well, that didn't show God in a good light, did it? Because Job shouldn't have been punished. He had never done anything wrong as far as living in sin. He had sinned, but he wasn't living in sin. And that brings us to Elihu here. Elihu simply expressed the majesty of God, but other than that, he brought absolutely nothing to the discussion at hand. He was just really a waste of time when it came to the discussion. He was just talking kind of to hear himself speak. God questioned Job, the first question, where was he when he created the earth? Answer with your understanding. God is being a little ironic here. We might use that word sarcastic, it seems to me. God was not looking for an answer. God questions, and his questions are never to gain information for himself. The question is always for the person he is asking to come to the understanding of where he is. Where are you, Adam? Did God know where Adam was? Absolutely. Adam needed to understand where Adam was, right? In his relationship with God. So, where were you, Job, when I laid the foundations of the earth? Well, no one was present when God laid the foundations of the earth. No human was present. Job couldn't answer that. God was pointing to the truth of the earth having a beginning, that he was the maker. He was the originator of this blueprint that created this wonderful earth on which we live. He's pointing this out to Job now. Job, I am the originator. I am the designer. I created this. Now, where were you when all that was going on? Were you somewhere that I didn't notice? Job's sitting there in silence, right? The earth was carefully measured. It was carefully weighed. The crust of the earth is an exact depth. It's an exact diameter. It's an exact circumference. It spins at an exact speed, 200 miles an hour, not 1,000 miles an hour. That would throw us all off into space. It's tilted on its axis perfectly. Now, would Job know how to do all that? No, Job would be completely ignorant on that stuff, wouldn't he? So Job is talking pretty tough when he wanted God to present himself to answer some questions or to ask me some questions. Now he's sitting in silence. So now the real questions begin. He asked Job about the mandate he had given the seas. He says, Job, you know how a woman, when she's getting ready to give birth, how that baby can't be kept in, that it's going to come forth? Job, that's the way the seas are. But do you know what? I've laid forth a mandate. Those seas can come so far and they can't come any further. Even in a hurricane or a storm, they might come out some, but then they always go back because I have laid an invisible border. You know, the earth surface is about 71% water. The average height of land is 2,230 feet. The average depth of the ocean is 13,000 feet. So the ocean is nearly 6 times as deep as the land is high. If the earth's surface was smoothed out, water would cover the entire earth by, on the average, of about 2 miles deep. Now that great amount of water is needed to keep the temperature properly regulated. That great amount of water is needed so that water can be vaporized, so it can properly rain on the earth. So God told Job, what can you tell me about that? Are you able to hold the water back? Can you keep it in its bed? Well, I'm sure Job was flabbergasted at that knowledge. Job remained silent. He asked Job if he was responsible for creating a new day. What about the new day, Job? He noticed, or God made made the point that he takes notice of every new day. He takes notice of the wicked every new day. He notices everything. The sun comes up. It's as if it's a new birth. Things are fresh. God notices that. He sees all. He's omniscient. It's almost as if he's asking Job, Job, do you know all things? What can you tell me about the things that I don't know? He asked Job if he'd entered the springs of the sea. Now we read about the springs of the sea also in Psalm 8:8, right? Those springs gush forth from the ocean's floor, and they're not salty, it's fresh water. We have that, fresh water. Now, freshwater springs have been discovered in the seas, and the earliest accounts that are recorded for us by people was by a man named Strabo, a Roman geographer in 63 BC, way past the time of Job. He lived from, or actually it was later than that, he lived from 63 BC to 21 AD. So after he was a grown man, he recorded that. But they have been observed off the coasts of Greece, Italy, Israel, and Syria. Also, they can be found off the seacoast of Australia. They've been found all along the eastern seaboard of the United States from New England all the way to Georgia. And so the springs of the sea, the paths of the sea, that's what Psalm 8:8 speaks about, not the springs of the sea. But none of that could have been known by Job unless God told him. And so God's beginning to question him. Job didn't have any idea about freshwater springs. Job knew about a dug well out in the backyard. That's what he knew. God spoke of the search in the King James, or the recesses of the deep in the New King James. Now, what he's talking about there, and that Hebrew term means the trenches in the sea. Now, trenches of the sea were eventually found. Some of them as deep as 6 miles. So we're talking about huge trenches in the sea. Job would have had no idea about that. And they're not found in the Mediterranean Sea. The deepest of the trenches aren't. And so that's the closest sea Job would have been to. And then he goes on to ask him if he'd ever entered the realm of the dead, if he'd ever seen the doors of the shadow of death. Now, as we look back over the history of humanity in the Bible, how many people can we think of that had ever died and been resurrected and came back to be restored to their former lives? Just a few, just a handful, right? We can think of a few in the Old Testament that Elijah had raised, at least one I'm thinking of, the widow's son. Then, of course, we get over to the New Testament. Some people had died and been brought back. We look in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, and I believe that's Paul speaking of himself when he said, I knew of a man that had gone into the Hadean realm, gone into paradise. But those people, even when they go into the Hadean realm, that side of paradise, and they're allowed to come back. And, of course, Lazarus, John chapter 11 is one, maybe one of the more famous ones, probably the most famous one we know about. When they come back, are they permitted to talk about their experience? They're not allowed to talk about or describe in any kind of detail or anything about what it's like. In fact, Paul said that it's not permitted, right? It's unlawful to speak about what is happening over there or to describe it. I don't even know that we have words in our languages that can properly describe what that is like. So, he asked Job, have you ever been there? Well, no, Job had never been there. He had no idea what that was like. Did Job expect to go there? Sure, he expected to go there, but he had never been there. Any comments, questions? Well, he continued with the physical earth. And he asked him, he said, Job, what about the breadth of the earth? And I think that as we look back on in chapter 26, Job could perceive the earth was of a circular shape and that it was suspended in space, but he couldn't perceive that the earth was a diameter of 8,000 miles. I don't think he could perceive that it had a circumference of 25,000 miles. I don't think he could, there's not a mountain tall enough or a tree tall enough where you could climb up into it and get a good enough look to say, boy, this was really a pretty good sized ball here I'm living on. But God knew that. He knew that it was the breadth of it and that it hung upon nothing. We talked last time about it hanging on nothing, about there being an empty space to the north in the sky where there were no stars. In fact, in all likelihood, Job had probably never been out of that small area in Arabia where he lived. He might have, but it's likely that he hadn't traveled far in that Middle Eastern area. And so it wasn't like he was able to know that much about it. And he was asked to give the answer to these questions if he had them. And what was his response? He was silent. He was silent. He didn't have an answer because it wasn't possible for him to know that. And then this is one that I thought was pretty telling. God asked him if he knew the places where the light and the darkness dwelt. Where does the light and the darkness dwell? And then he kind of answered it and said, but you're not old enough to know that, Job. You're not old enough. You haven't been around long enough to know where the light and the darkness. Now, no one was present. No person, no human was present when God spoke light into existence. And when he divided the light from the day, or the light from the darkness, rather. Now, light was perceived at that time as coming from a place, from a far away place. And it was understood by those people to have a place of abiding. It would go and it as if it had a house. The light would come from way over there, and it would come to here, and then it would go back. And pseudoscientists in years gone by, they mocked and scorned the writings of Moses when he said, on the first day, God said, let there be light. And there was light. And then you work your way down to day 4, and what was created? The sun and the moon and the stars. The sun was the greater light to rule the day, and the moon was the lesser light to rule the night. And they said, see, that's not possible. You can't have light without the sun. Well, later on, we came to find out that light is the result of rapid variations that travel 186,000 miles per second. It takes about 8 minutes for light to leave the sun and to make its path in a straight line to the earth. Now, what we also found out is that light exists apart from the sun. Because when you walk into a room and you flip that switch over there, what happens? The light comes on. Even when the sun is or when the earth has rotated and the sun is shining on the other side of the world and it is pitch dark on this side, right? You have light. You have light with electric light bulbs. What about static electricity? You have light, right? That produces light. There are different forms of light. And so you do not have to have the sun or stars or anything else to produce light. All you have to do is have light. And so God produced light, and then He produced the sun to sustain a certain type of light for the period of time that He would allow the universe to exist. We go camping, we build a fire, right? That produces light. Any comments, questions?
There is an ambient light. You go outside at night when it's pitch black. Give yourself a little time to adjust. There's enough light you can see.
Yeah, there's ambient light. Now you can find yourself in a place where there is no light. Have you ever been to Mammoth Cave in Kentucky? Man.
I've been in a big cooler when the lights went on.
Yep. You get in those caves in up in Kentucky, and the ranger will say, "Okay, I'm going to turn the light off. Make sure that you're holding on to something or you're touching something, because you can lose your sense of balance in pitch black. And boy, you can't see your hand in front of your face when the light goes off. And that's dark now. And I don't know who, I've talked to people who said they weren't afraid of the dark. I'm not afraid of the dark. I am afraid of what's in the dark. And I do not like the dark. God goes on and He asks Job about the treasures in the snow and in the hail. I'd never heard about treasures in the snow and in the hail. And then I came across a doctor by the name of Franklin T. Schutt from Canada. And he set forth the result of 17 years of research in the value of snowfall. And he found that snow collected from the atmosphere contained 4 kinds of chemical fertilizer. Free ammonia, nitrates, I put nitrates down, nitrates, nitrites, and this other type of ammonia. I practiced on how to pronounce it, and then I have forgotten. That's it. And those are in a form that can be used in plant life. And it's estimated that has a value, this is pre-inflation numbers, of $14.08 per acre. So I don't know if that's $100 now or what. Now, Brother Haley seemed to think that this treasure was seen in the effect God used it in battle. He has used the elements in battle to wage war against the nation of Israel's enemies in the past. We see that in Joshua 10:11, Psalm 33:7, and Jeremiah 50:25. Any comments? Well, what about this one? Did Job know how light was distributed around the globe? Or how was it that God distributed the east wind? What about the wind patterns? How was light distributed? Did Job understand the principles of natural law that produced thunder and lightning? Did you understand that? And that's a lot more complex than at first we might think. When we're looking at the way thunder or particularly how lightning reacts and how it strikes and and how the energy is created to do that. And then he asked him, he said, who is the father of the rain and the dew? Well, certainly no man is. People for years have attempted to cause it to rain, but often unsuccessfully. And back in the 50s, they said they would be able to go to places where there have been droughts, and they would make it to where it could rain, and they still haven't been able to do that, because you still have to have a rain cloud when you go to seed that rain cloud, right? And they still have very little success in doing that. And who is the mother of ice and frost? Is there a woman who is the mother of ice and frost? He talks about ice. Is humanity the cause of the unusual conduct of ice? What usually happens when you heat something? Like say you heat metal. What usually happens to metal when you heat it? Short of melting it, it'll expand. What happens when you freeze it or you cool it? It contracts. That happens to most everything except water. You cool water, you freeze water, it expands. You heat it, it goes back. It's the opposite. What's that? It'll evaporate, it'll go away. It goes into the air, right? And that's part of the water cycle. Right? Solomon talked about the water cycle. And so that is the law governing all objects except for water. Did Job know about that? No, Job didn't know that. No way of knowing it. God asked Job if he could limit the influence of constellations. He mentioned all of these constellations, and I thought this was very interesting. His ignorance is extended to the heavens. And he mentioned Orion. You see, Orion is visible in October, and it kind of ushers in winter. And so what he's asking is, he wants to know if Job or anyone else has the ability to alter the constellations. If you are able to alter when Orion presents himself, in essence what you're doing is you're changing the seasons. If you can prevent Orion from appearing in the sky, what you've done is now you've prevented winter from coming, because he presents himself in October before winter comes. Can you do that, Job? Can you alter the seasons? Really is what he's saying. And then he talks about manipulating these other heavenly bodies. Did Job bind the cluster of stars together, that form Pleiades? Pleiades is a constellation of stars of more than 200 stars. Can you bind those stars together? Those stars go through space, and we know that these constellations are in an orbit of their own, and they stay together. More than 200 stars. That's amazing, isn't it? Can you do that, Job? Can you maintain these stars where they stay together? Then he moves on to the animal kingdom. What about the lioness? What is it about a lion that causes her to go out and hunt prey for her cubs and bring that prey back to feed to those cubs? Why doesn't she just eat it herself? She's not going to do that for any other animal. What is it about her that is instilled in her to take care of her cubs? Or all the cubs in that pride? That's amazing, isn't it? She's not going to do that for another pride's cubs, but she'll do it for her own and for any other cub in that pride. Well, God has put that instinct in her. And then he mentions the raven. The raven was a despised bird. Who's going to feed the raven? is a person going to feed the raven, or is a person going to allow that despised bird to die? It was said when the raven cries out in hunger that it's crying out to God for food because no person is going to take care of it. Well, God has put into motion these things in the animal kingdom that allow these animals to survive. In the arrangement of life, we see these marks of wisdom which surpass the skill of humanity. So all of these questions that God has put forth to Job, at the end of each question, all you hear is silence. Job is just sitting there, and I can just see him with his jaw dropped, thinking, I really wish I hadn't asked for this. This is not turning out like I thought it would. I really thought I had a handle on this until he showed up. Now I'm in trouble. And really, this is just the beginning. Any comments? Well, he moves on. You got something?
There's something about the snowflake that has the design, and whoever studies those they know choose are
They're all different.
they all have
Every snowflake is different. Yeah. You know, it's just like a fingerprint. No two fingerprints are the same, and that's quite amazing in and of itself. They're all different, and no two snowflakes are the same. That's true. Well, God continues his questioning here of Job on into chapter 39. He talks about the wild animals. He continues with them. He talks about the wild goat. Do you know when they bring forth their young? God is paying attention. Do you know when the wild goat births their young? Well, of course not. They live up in the high mountains. Do you know the gestation period of these animals? Can you explain, Job, how a young animal can be born and grow to strength in a short period of time and then be able to care for itself and never have to come back to its mother? Can you explain that? Because certainly what we know as people is our children can't do that. Our children can't do that. Even when they reach what societies around the world call the age of majority, most of the time they still can't take care of themselves, right? And whoever's fault that is, I don't know, but we're still taking care of them, right? I have a daughter that's 28, lives in Memphis. I guess she's taking care of herself. I tell her every time I see you, it just costs me money. You know, I tell them all that though. He wanted to know when the wild deer birthed their young. You know, Job didn't know that. They were wild. They were quite timid. They seemed defenseless, but somehow they made it pretty good out there in the wild, didn't they? Could Job have lived in the wild like these animals? No way. No way. Could we live in the wild like these animals? Somehow they're able to find food. They're able to keep from being eaten by other wild animals. We'd make it till the first wild animal came along and had lunch on us, right? That's about how long we could last. He turns his attention to the wild ass, who set the wild ass free? God placed that wild donkey in the deserted places far from the cities. He provided them with ample pasture land in the mountains and the highlands, right? They could roam free. They could take care of themselves as they saw fit. And they could take care of themselves, right? Now these wild donkeys, they were untamable. They would not surrender to the whip of the taskmaster. You just could not do anything with them. But they were able to take care of themselves. And Job, could you create an animal like that? And could you instill in that animal the ability to take care of itself the way I have? No. And then, of course, my favorite animal in the whole of the Bible is the unicorn. The unicorn and the ostrich. Well, of course, the unicorn is the wild ox. And the point of that animal was that it just could not be tamed into pulling a plow. And that was a favored hunting target, and that's why it went out of existence. And really, if you see any statues of the wild ox, it actually did have two horns, one right behind the other. But what he's talking about when he asks him about the wild ox, and that's a bad translation when he says unicorn. But when he asks him about the wild ox, in essence, what he's saying is, if you can't manage the wild ox, and the wild ox was not manageable, he absolutely was not. He could not be tamed because they tried to tame this wild ox because he was strong. He would have been a wonderful domesticated animal to use to work the fields. He was not manageable. You could not tame him. But God asked Job, and in essence, he's asking all people, if you cannot manage the wild ox, what makes you think you can manage the universe? How can you manage the universe? You can't even manage one wild ox. You can't take care of the universe. And then he moves to the war horse and the hawk. And he asks him, where was it that this war horse got its strength? And the war horse was obviously used for war. It would go into battle, and war horses were very dangerous in and of themselves. Soldiers were killed by the horse. And they were brave, and they were vicious. And he says, the war horse is not afraid like the grasshopper. And who caused that to happen? Who put the personality or the instincts into the war horse as opposed to that which is in the grasshopper? Who made it so that the war horse could go into battle and could fight the way that he fights and have the strength that he has, but the grasshopper is afraid? Have you ever noticed that when you go out into a field, or like a hay field, and you start walking through before it's been cut, and all those grasshoppers start jumping, and why do they do that? Well, it's their instinct to do it, but they're afraid something's going to grab them. Okay? Because birds eat them, all kinds of things. I raise honeybees, and normally I'm pretty lucky when I raise a new queen. Well, what happens with a queen is it takes, I'd have to look, I think 24 days for a queen to go from an egg to emerging. And then what happens is this queen comes out of the cell and she flies off on a mating flight. And she'll mate how many ever times. And once the drone, the male honeybee, mates with her, he dies. It's just tragic. Tragic. So he falls to the earth. And she may stay gone for however long. Well, like I say, I have been fortunate in that my queens have always come back. And so I just had to combine a couple of hives because I had a queen that did not make her way back. So anything could have happened. But probably what happened is here this queen was trying to make her way back, or was on her way to a mating flight or whatever, but she's a big old bee. And probably a hungry bird came by and saw that and just snapped her right up. And that's what happens with grasshoppers, right? They see something coming along and they're out of here. They're leaving. Well, the war horse is like that. The war horse goes toward the danger. That's how they have that in them, a certain amount of that in them to begin with. And then, of course, they're trained more to be that way. But they have that in them. And where did that come from? Well, Job didn't have the answer because he didn't put it in the war horse. God put it in that horse. He asked him about the hawk and the eagles. Well, Job wasn't the designer of the migration patterns. They know, and that's amazing, isn't it? The birds know when to migrate, and it's not just the eagles and the hawks. He didn't command the hawk to spread his wings and mount up on high, or to land on the top of the mountain. Some hawks have been seen at 10,000 feet. And they have a wonderful eyesight. They can spot a mouse from way up there, right? Or a rabbit, or whatever the case may be. But God designed that. Everything has a design. And Job, can you do any of that? And so we go back to the question. Job, you wanted to stand before God, and you wanted to ask or be asked. So how's that working out? And God hasn't even made his way over to these other three fellas sitting around the fire with dread in their hearts, knowing they are next in line. They are in trouble. Any comments, questions? All right, we have 2 more chapters, and I will bring a test with me next time, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Thank you so much.